Is ESG a distraction, with company execs and investors just ticking boxes and greenwashing their actions merely to satisfy rules or mission statements with no real-world impact? Or is ESG a fundamental practice? That is, that it's not a distraction. It reflects the way the world is going. It future-proofs balance sheets and investor portfolios as the world warms, and it is a spark for real, tangible climate action. Those are the questions at hand. That's enough for me. I'm here to promote a healthy environment for debate to make sure we keep things social by governing this debate fairly. If you see what I did there. So the motion we have is somewhere around here. But so remember, we have this House believes that ESG is a distraction from climate action. So we have a team for, and we have a team against. Truman and his friends virtually. Here are the rules. Now this is going to be very rapid fire. I'm here as a referee. I'm going to keep everyone to time. There are two teams of three arguing for and against the motion in 3 5-minute rounds. So each speaker has about 2 to 3 minutes to make their sort of punchiest and most persuasive points. After 3 rounds of the for and against, we'll hear from our judges. We have two judges who will, constructively comment on what they've heard, maybe what the team's missed, maybe what they should think about as they make their arguments. And then there will be a very short break, and there will be a final round of rebuttals, sort of taking in what the judges said. Each team will nominate one person to come up to take a final stand, taking 2 or 3 minutes to appeal to your hearts and minds in the audience, who are the actual judges here. And we will poll who wins, and then the question will be settled once and for all, and we can all move on. So it'd be helpful to get a baseline, I think. So let's get an initial reading. And this is New York Times, sparing no expense. We're using some tried and true technology, which is clapping. So just let's keep it a little civil. Maybe at the end we can be a little more boisterous. But let's get a reading of where we stand now, and then let's see if any minds are changed. So again, this House believes that ESG is a distraction from climate action. If you are for the motion, let's have a little round of applause. Okay. And now, are you against the motion? Ooh. I don't know if that's supportive or inspiring. It's a finely balanced room here. Okay, so that's where we stand. And so we're going to jump right into it with round 1, for and against. On the for team, we have Sophia Hamblin-Wong. And on the against team, we have Yanis Ioannou, who is joining us very bright and early from Miami, Florida. And we thank you for doing that. And in your documents and program, you can read more about them. But we're going to go for and then against. So, Sophia, it's over to you. You have 2.5 minutes.
So in January 2020, I left my burning country of Australia to go to Davos to speak at the annual meeting there on a panel called Building a New Carbon Economy. While I was there, I was presenting to the largest cement, steel, chemicals and oil and gas producers in the world about what a decarbonised future would really look like. I was there to talk about the technology that I'm working on in Australia, which is in carbon capture and utilisation. So turning CO2 into usable materials for the circular economy, turning a waste product into a new product like cements, plasterboards and other things. Now, what I realised in that room, telling them about this technology that exists right now that is permanent, natural, scalable and profitable, is that I was the only person in the room that was still going to be alive in 2050 and also working. So there were a lot of CEOs there claiming to be, environmental heroes because they were committing to net zero by 2050, but they really didn't have the same skin in the game as what I did. Now, afterwards, a CEO from a cement company came up to me and he said, "Wow, that technology that you're working on is amazing. I'd really love to use it. But the thing is that I can't be guaranteed that my competitors are also going to use that technology and impose that cost. And until we have consistency and regulation of all of the industry, I can't take that cost." This was while my country was still burning from the bushfires, and that was quite confronting. In the intervening years, we've been trying to raise capital from private markets and talking to a lot of those same companies about ESG, and they have very robust ESG metrics, but they're not making the investments in climate tech that are necessary, that are relevant to the urgency of the problem. They have great ESG ratings, but they're not making the investments. And this is something that my party will continue to talk about. When we think about a net zero 2050, we want to be creating a more robust, sustainable, just and equitable future. And we need to ensure that we're racing towards that and not delaying. And that's what ESG is doing right now. It's delaying that pace of acceleration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia. Relevant to the urgency of portfolios, a strong start. Giannis, the against side. Over to you.
Ladies and gents, a very good morning, esteemed members of the jury. I couldn't be happier to do this at 5 a.m. Miami time, also because the organizers gave me the easy side of this argument. Let me be very clear and very quick. First, how could we possibly be distracted from a path we have never been on? We knew about climate change all the way back to 1896. We linked carbon dioxide to temperatures. We knew in 1938 that it leads to global warming. We had a theory about climate change in 1956. For God's sakes, we've been holding COP since 1995, 10 whole years before the term ESG made an appearance. So in academia, we call this a spurious correlation. We did nothing before, we did nothing after ESG. Therefore, again, point number one, how can we be distracted from a path that we have never been on? Second, ESG is not a distraction. ESG is a reflection. It reflects the unfolding moral, ethical, sociological processes and debates that are taking place. Look at abortion rights in the US, issues related to human rights, LGBTQ, in general, all of these highly controversial issues. We haven't agreed on them as a society. We didn't have the debates. So my opponents are going to say, oh, ESG data is problematic, it's confusing. Of course it is. We never discussed these issues. ESG is a symptom, it's not the underlying disease. Last but not least, let's be honest. The real distraction is the weaponization of ESG by the political right based on a false anti-ESG rhetoric, which is even reflected in the thesis of this House. Let's be clear. If the ESG agenda had indeed been a distraction, then the political right would have been the first to embrace it. It is precisely why the ESG agenda can have a positive impact that the political right and vested interests are fighting so viciously against it. Ex-VP Mike Pence, regressive states like Ohio, Utah, West Virginia, and their attorney generals, they're attacking ESG because ESG has an impact. So to summarize my 3 points, we cannot be distracted from a path we've never been on. ESG is not a distraction, it's a reflection, and it's currently being weaponized by the right and extreme right because it matters. Therefore, it is calling ESG a distraction that is the distraction. The real problem here is the failure of our national and governance institutions to coordinate action. Thank you.
Clapped off there. Thank you, Giannis. Okay. Strong start. Symptom, not a disease, in his opinions. Okay, on to round two, which we have another virtual member, which is Nicola Bartlett from the CDP, arguing against, and the 4 is Georgia Elliott-Smith from Element 4. And Georgia, the floor is yours to argue for, and then Nicolette will come after you again.
Thank you very much. Well, how do you follow that? Well, hopefully with some very persuasive arguments. So first of all, ESG ratings are the corporate equivalent of giving an award to a serial killer for being kind to puppies. Of course, being kind to puppies is really important, but it's not the main issue. In the same way, the dozens of categories against which corporates are rated in ESG are important, but they're not the most urgent and pressing thing. ESG ratings gamify corporate responsibility, allowing major polluters to offset their climate harm by doing other great things, important things like cybersecurity and great training and development, but not the most urgent and pressing things that must be done to avoid climate chaos. ESG reporting standards are voluntary. Companies that participate can select their own reporting categories, they can select their own boundaries for reporting, which means that they're able to fully omit major impacts from their supply chains and able to put the attention on things that they want you to see and divert away from the things that they don't want you to see. Things like dark money, lobbying to derail and delay meaningful climate action that might dent their profits. They only compare companies against other contemporaries in the same sector. So if you have marginally better performance than one of your competitors, then you win the game. This is how companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Glencore Mining, major fossil fuel polluters are able to win the ESG ratings game and be lauded for their approaches to environment and society. ESG ratings and reporting standards fail to acknowledge the fact that some sectors must radically transform in order to face the climate crisis, even terminated entirely to prevent climate breakdown. Sadly, ESG ratings are a product of a neoliberal fantasy that somehow companies that profit from pollution are able to put in place adequate checks and balances to limit that pollution themselves. This is not the case. Also, let's not forget that ESG ratings and reporting standards are brands in themselves. They rely on the patronage and support of the major corporates which they claim to regulate. And so you're not going to have a very strong reporting standard that's taken up by many corporates if you're too challenging. The only way to meaningfully regulate carbon emissions is for strong government policy, to adequately price the externality of pollution and bring that into the business. As any working parent will tell you, you can't do everything well. ESG ratings that apply dozens of metrics create a dangerous distraction from the real action that is needed for meaningful carbon reduction. In the sage words of the author Mark Manson, you only have so many fucks to give. Choose wisely.
Okay, thank you, Georgia. Tough one, yeah. Neoliberal fantasy that merely gamifies CSR. So we're going to go to Nicolette Bartlett now from the CDP, virtual. Nicolette?
Great, hi there. So while that was a really fantastic set of arguments, we need to remember that for this notion to be true, the other debate team will need to prove to you that not only is ESG consistently distracted from taking climate action, but they will also need to prove to you what other driver or drivers would have ensured climate action in the absence of ESG. In reality, all we have to do is prove that ESG has been additive. I'm glad I'm not on the other team. I work in an organization that has been leveraging and riding that ESG wave for over 20 years. When the CDP was founded, it was a time when global governance was broken on a global issue. Governments were not going to regulate the private sector to reduce emissions. And if you don't have the private sector reducing emissions, how do you get there? So in the absence of that, we looked at the other stakeholder. Our founders looked at the other stakeholder that had an ability to put pressure on the private sector, and that was institutional investors. So we began to work with them to drive better decision making and about putting climate into governance at a fundamental level. So the very first questionnaire was sent out 20 years ago, and it was literally delivered by mail in those days. Can you just imagine? Now, I don't have time to give you the many statistics of how, by focusing minds on how climate change needs to be incorporated into corporate governance, how this has changed decision-making and reduced emissions. But suffice to say, you will already see the significant momentum there now is when it comes to bringing corporate government and changing corporate governance regulation across the globe. Notably, of course, potentially the SEC, but the EU and the UK at the same time, and also in China. Now, this would not have happened without ESG. Another example, without ESG, there would not be the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Now, who cares about the Science-Based Target Initiative, right? Well, interestingly, I'll give you one example. The Dutch court that has just ruled and ordered Shell, a major fossil fuel company, which, by the way, climate change is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, has been ordered to decrease its target even more. It simply is not good enough. What did they use to base their argument? Heavily relied on the science behind the Science-Based Targets Initiative. ExxonMobil gets taken to court for, let's say, not being entirely accurate on climate change. Let's be kind about that. How would that have happened without the ESG movement? Now, please prove to me why those two examples on their own are not climate action. Finally, when you need to prove that it doesn't reduce emissions. So, small group of companies, albeit, yes, only 2,000 companies have committed to Science-Based Targets Initiative, but they have reduced their emissions by 29% over the last 5 years. So remember, not only do the other team need to prove that ESG they have to prove that it has not been driving action. And all we have to prove is that it has been additive. It is not the best driver and the only driver, but it is one of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolette. Thank you, Nicolette. Okay, only proof that it's additive. All right, moving on. We have our third round. This is an in-person showdown between Tarek Fancy and Truman Siemens. Gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Tarek Fancy. I feel like this debate topic is almost made for me because it traces my career history. See, I used to actually sit on that side. I was BlackRock's first ever chief investment officer for sustainable investing. I applied everything that they're saying at the center of $10 trillion in the largest asset manager in capitalism. And by the way, I started my career as an investment banker, like I'm a capitalist. Everything my teammates said that they saw at the micro level, I saw at the macro level. It literally, most of the theory behind it is nonsense. There's an obvious answer of what we should be doing. Think of competitive markets like competitive sports. They all have rules and referees. There is no such thing as a free market. It's a lie, right? So the idea is you can change the rules and you get different outcomes, all of which are market outcomes. How did we regulate cigarette companies? We didn't look at their ESG scores. We actually got the government in to force them to do something that was in the public interest but against their short-term interest. That is actually what we need today. But instead, a bunch of potentially useful tools, standards, all kinds of things that are being created by the industry are being combined into products that have absolutely no impact, but move money around to get higher fees, and narratives that convince you that the market will self-correct, that there are no such thing as referees, because in this sport, self-refereeing and good sportsmanship is the only answer available to us. And so I left the industry. I remember telling a friend, I said, it's kind of like we were giving wheatgrass to a cancer patient, right? The cancer is spreading, and this is well-marketed and green, but it's not going to help. And I only went public and started making this argument after I worked with the university on a study that showed that the more that you give the public these messages around good sportsmanship, and we're doing this, we're doing that, the more they get distracted from the conclusion, which is that ESG assets are increasing alongside carbon emissions. And not only that, there's a statistically significant difference for Americans, where the more they see those headlines, the less likely they are to support the government intervening. So think of it this way. You're giving them wheatgrass juice, and what they're going to say is, oh, they can have chemo at the same time. No, it's being marketed so well that it's distracting people, and they say, maybe this wheatgrass juice will work, right? Maybe I'll just skip chemo and see, which is kind of like saying, maybe I'll keep doing this ESG stuff that we can see clearly is not working from the latest IPCC report, and we'll just instead, just push off the regulation because it's expensive and difficult and requires sacrifice. And I think the most important thing we can see is that we know the leaders on the other side know that today, because when they were faced with a systemic curve that was moving quickly and required government action to flatten, they told us to wear masks, they restricted travel. But the longer term one that doesn't align with their short-term financial incentives, that one seems to be left to bankrupt neoliberal theories being rehashed once again in 2022. Thanks.
Thank you. More ills of neoliberalism. Truman Siemens for the against team.
Truman Siemens, CEO and founder of Open Source Climate, OS Climate. I feel like the debate that we're having is sort of stranded in time, in 2015, in an earlier age of ESG. And so if we're talking about an earlier age and not thinking forward to what ESG and the use of the tool can and will be and is transforming into, we're not having the right debate. I would hold forward. So let's be clear and honest about the plain fact that in the absence so the allocation of assets across asset classes by institutional investors and banks is the primary available tool that we have in the absence of regulation, as we wait for regulation to come in to drive capital from the laggards, from the problem into the solution. The use of incentives through blended finance and these kinds of things will only nip around the edges. And the government sticks and carrots that are linked to ESG are going to come in phase, but not quickly enough, no matter what happens, distraction aside. On the other hand, the capabilities of asset owners, asset managers, and banks to truly implement ESG-aligned investing through and differentiate between fakes and real is improving literally every day before our eyes. The speed of innovation that is happening is tremendous. So some of that is being done, for example, through the work in open source transparency and the development of tools like Open Source Climate, and together with the users and providers of technology, BNP Paribas, BNY Mellon, LSEG, and others, working cooperatively to build the tools that are needed. We do not debate the statements that it's very true that investing heretofore has largely been done by lazy investors, asset owners, applying single scores that are poorly developed to invest in ESG. Going forward, we all will have the tools needed to shine a bright light, to discern, and take note that I think the proof is in the pudding. The ESG funds, for example, Generation and Investment Management, Parnassus, Brown Advisory, that are best performing in class, they're also the best performing large cap funds in the world. And the proof is in the pudding. So not a distraction. In fact, one of the most important levers that we have to preserve. Thank you.
Is this on? Oh, yes, it is now. Okay, great. That was a invigorating 3 rounds of debate. And now we turn it over to our judges. What have they missed? What should they come back with? What points should they expand on? Et cetera, et cetera. So we have 2 judges to comment on that, and then again we'll have a little bit of a conference, and then they'll come back with their final rebuttals to really drive their points home. So our first judge I want to introduce is Sandrine Dixon de Cleve from the Club of Rome. Sandrine, have at it.
Okay, I always find these debates fascinating. And we're always put in a bit of a difficult situation, as many of us straddle both sides. But I do believe, having listened to this debate, that as we have seen that the ESG framework has actually grown the amount of funds and investment, in particular during COVID, what I was lacking a little bit from the arguments was unpacking what else do we need? Coming back to actually the previous debate that we had around emergency, if ESG is truly not solving our problem, in particular the planetary emergency, and continues to be a greenwashing tool, what are other elements out there that we can start to bring into our financial sector that will truly give the signal that we need? So that would be one question. Now, that wasn't really the question of this debate, but that profound need to think about what else is really missing. The other key point that I felt was also missing is how is it within this current system can we up the game? Again, especially coming from BlackRock, what actually has to change within the current system to make ESG truly relevant to the urgency at hand? And that I actually also didn't really get from this discussion. And I'm just going to throw a wild card. Because the key issue, again, coming to the links between the opening session and this one, is ESG actually just focusing on financing change rather than changing the finance system? And is the system actually broken? And is that what we should actually be debating rather than whether ESG is actually doing what it needs to do? I'll leave it now to my dear friend Tara. I'm sure she's going to come up with some wonderful interjections.
Yes. Okay. Second judge is Dr. Tara Shine from Change by Degrees. Over to you.
Thank you, Sandrine. Thank you to the teams for and against. Yeah, so building on what Sandrine said, I worked a lot for governments in the past on the regulation side of things. And what I found a constant break on what governments were brave enough to do in terms of regulation was they didn't feel they had support of business, investors, and citizens. So my first question is, how can we get the regulation that you have argued for without energizing and engaging the business and investor sector? And can ESG play a role in that? So how do we get the regulation without engaging business? Another question that I'd love you all to address a little more. How can ESG inform long-term thinking? Our big problem is we don't have long-term thinking. Both the corporate sector and the political sector, both of which we need to change the system, are stuck in short-term thinking. So how can ESG actually get past a tick box exercise and into changing the way that we do business, the way that we plan, the way that we invest? A third question, one close to my heart. Can ESG actually get decision makers to care about climate change, the future of humanity, and the future of our planet? What are the triggers in ESG for creating some kind of emotional connection within our decision makers? As Sophia said, they don't have skin in the game. Most of them are going to be dead by the time 2050 comes around. But our kids, our young people right now, they have skin in the game. They are emotionally connected. That's why they act and react differently. So can ESG do anything for emotional connections to these problems? And linking to what Sandrine's last point is, I think this is really important. In a very broken capitalist world, how can ESG work? Or do we have to completely change the system? And within that, how does people power fit into ESG? Where is ESG listening to people and what people want? Or is ESG just a conversation amongst a small group of blokes in a room deciding what way they want the future of their corporate sector to be? So where is ESG listening, and how is it going to be informed by and driven by people power? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Some harsh but fair criticism there. And we're approaching the final stage of this. There will be one more round of rebuttals, but our teams need to confer amongst themselves and take in that feedback and nominate a person to do that. And in the meantime, we're going to show a short video while they are doing that, and so you can think again about whether you've changed your mind or not. Remember, this House believes that ESG is a distraction from climate action, for and against. We'll show a video, think about it, download the New York Times app, maybe do today's Wordle, and then we will be back in just a couple minutes for the final rebuttals.
Whoa. This looks like literally the end of the world.
30 named storms formed this season. The National Hurricane Center had to borrow letters from the Greek alphabet.
Oh, shit. Terrifying.
Okay, let's see what this is.
In the hands of Democratic politicians, climate change is like systemic racism in the sky.
This isn't about science. This is really about government controlling almost every aspect of your life.
It's not about science, it's about them trying to control you. That is arguably the most ignorant thing I've ever watched or heard in my whole life.
Many of the alarmists on global warming, they got a problem because the science doesn't back them up.
I believe the ability to measure with precision the degree of human activity's impact on the climate is subject to more debate.
Climate change is not a subjective thing. It shouldn't be like a debate.
And I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not a fan of Boris Johnson. I don't really care for much that comes out of his mouth. But even he doesn't deny climate change.
We have a lot of different types of parties in Norway, but even the far-right parties don't deny climate change, because if they did, they would be publicly ridiculed.
Yeah.
It makes me really angry to see all of this. America being this complacent about climate change doesn't only affect them, it affects the whole world.
Polar bears that live on Svalbard in Norway are coming to the city center because they're losing their habitat and their food.
In France too, we have wildfires, and it's happening more and more often.
We have storms who flatten entire forests.
In Zimbabwe, we're receiving less rainfall.
The typhoons, the cyclones.
The typhoon in Bengal.
They're getting stronger by the day.
It's clear that America has more money. Why isn't that extra money being used to protect the environment and to fight climate change?
I think this is about setting an example. If America can't get it right, how can we expect the rest of the world to know how to combat climate change?
Somebody has to lead the way and set an example. It has got to be you.
Okay. Gotta wrap it up. We gotta, who's gonna do it? I hear on that side. They're right up to the wire. Okay, remember, this House believes that ESG is a distraction from climate action. We're going to hear from the for and the against teams. Again, okay. So we're going to have, if I could invite our final rebuttal teams up to the stage. Making their very last minute notes is Tarek there. It's going to be Tarek Fancy, who we heard from recently, debating with Nicolette Bartlett virtually. So we will, the same, Tarek, yes, so the same order. We have 2.5 minutes of rebuttals. This is your final chance to persuade the audience for the 4 case. Tarek, over to you.
Thank you. So let's first all start off by calling ESG today what it is. It's a free market self-corrects theory by another name. People don't call it that. When I drank the Kool-Aid when I went in, I didn't think that's what it was. But in the end, it's effectively saying if you have more data, more measurement, and so on, the sport of capitalism will magically self-correct because players who haven't been playing sportsmanlike will suddenly realize the need to do so. The other team has made it seem like the answer isn't obvious. No, the answer is obvious. It's calling in the refs. We've known about the topic of externalities for 100 years in economics and exactly how to deal with them, internalizing the costs. Indeed, 4 years ago, someone won a Nobel Prize in economics for making precisely the argument that we need to apply a price on carbon across all of the markets to reach systemic change. And I think a lot of the question would be, well, what can business do? Is there an alternative? Yes, there is one. It's not feeding people a free market self-corrects theory that is clearly distracting the public, because if you give them a win-win solution where they can do nothing and leave the system the way it is and solve all of our problems, that obviously beats sacrifice. And we have to keep an eye on the results. Right? All the numbers you heard from that team, all of that is all great, but all we're seeing every year is ESG assets go up, ESG, words, sustainable, and it goes up alongside emissions and inequality. And while it may seem like we could have all the time in the world to wait, right? And they say, oh, well, if we just give ESG enough time, the free market will self-correct. I have to point out that there's some privilege that comes out of making that argument. First of all, what am I relative to BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink? I'm younger, I'm poorer, and I'm darker skinned. He's the one I should be having this debate against. And everyone in the industry knows that. But that's not happening. And who is this delay in addressing climate change hurting most? It's not just amplifying the costs, it's transferring them to the youngest, the poorest, and the darkest skinned people in the world. The arguments that have been brought up in favor of ESG have ignored the fact that it's a free market self-correct theory. It's implied that ESG is fighting off the right, as if the real debate is between libertarianism from Peter Thiel and ESG, a marketing decoy that's a free market self-correct theory, not obviously calling in the rest to do their jobs, which has apparently not been happening in Western democracy since the 80s. And so I'll leave you with one point that's really important. Today, we risk the future of capitalism because younger generations, Gen Z and millennials, no longer believe in the system. And the reason for that is viewed from this side of the aisle. This doesn't look like a collective mistake that we're all making and we're all in it together. It looks kind of like a heist.
Well, okay, marketing decoy. Nicolette, final rebuttal for the against team.
I mean, really great. I mean, nothing what the speakers are saying is not true. But again, this is not what we are debating, right? The benchmark is very spurious in the first place. Distraction from what? What is it actually distracting us from rather than being additive? Not once have we had that. Is BlackRock being crap about ES? Absolutely. I'm not disagreeing that. None of the speakers on the side of the house would. Do we need fundamental regulation on this? Absolutely. Is the finance system broken and we need whole new climate institutions? 100% agree, right? We're not arguing against that. Do we need political space from business and investors? Absolutely. Does ESG distract from that? Prove that, right? That's all that has to be proven here. Of course, we need regulation. Of course, we need to change minds. And of course, the system is broken. Now, Deutsche Bank gets raided for greenwashing. Explain to me how that is not going to drive us to have more people say our institutions are broken, our climate change systems are broken, our financial system is broken, we need to change it. That is as a result of the notion of greenwashing being invented, which, by the way, is on the back of the notion of investors and ESG. Explain to me how that is not additive. It is an easy scapegoat for the systematic and chronic failure of our climate governance and institutions, ESG. It is not the reason that we do not have climate action. None of that has been proven by the speakers. Thank you.
Okay. Final rebuttals. Excellent. Thank you, Nicolette. Okay. It's the moment of truth. Remember, we are settling this question this morning. This House believes that ESG is a distraction from climate action. ESG is a distraction, the for case. So now is your time to really give your vote for the motion. Applause, please. Okay, okay. The algorithms in the back are crunching that. Okay, and now ESG is a distraction from climate action against the motion. Whoa. I think maybe just edged it, but as I found in these debates, this is because we picked these questions. This is a live issue. I would say maybe against, just edged it, but I wouldn't. Again, a couple days, the machines will crunch the numbers, and we'll write about it in the New York Times. So that was a very spirited debate. Thanks to Sophia, Yanis, Georgia, Nicolette, Tarek, Truman, Sandrine, Tara. What a fantastic round of debating about a very topical subject. You know, is it relevant to the urgency of the problems? Is it merely a symptom, not a disease? It's a neoliberal fantasy that's just gamifying CSR. No, you just need to prove that it's additive, and it is in fact driving change. But is it just moving money around? There's no impact. No, there are tools coming that will shine a light on what's happening. Is it just a marketing decoy, or is it used as an easy scapegoat for other problems? I mean, this is something that I think we can all debate for time immemorial. Maybe the against just edged it, but I don't think it was that far away. So just please thank all of our speakers and judges again. Oh, fine. Okay, another wild card.
I don't have a microphone.
Here it is.
It's not a wild card. I just want to point to how fantastic this debate has been and how important and prominent it is. And I think, Nikki, well done you. You nailed it. And the only reason you nailed it is the word additive. And so not that any of the very prominent and important arguments that this team had was not absolutely true and the reason why everyone applauded. But I think it is so important, the points that you have brought up, and exactly what we need to focus on.
Hear the study where I mentioned that it's distracting from climate action? I mean, that's literally the entire point around it. No one has any debate, any data to come against that.
Exactly, it's too late. But it is a distraction. I agree, but on the other hand, no, absolutely. But I think that the points that Nikki made were fundamental in understanding all of the new structural frameworks that we need in order to not make it a distraction.
Thanks very much.